Hello, everyone. I am Mark L. Vincent. I direct the Convene Consulting Network. I am joined today by a good friend and a longstanding colleague, Randal Dick, someone that I consider to be among the foremost experts in governance. And it is a subject that stumps a lot of people, and it reduces a lot of value for the organization if they stay stumped. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And Randal, thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Randal also is recruiting a Convene team in the Seattle area, and he has worked internationally and helped a number of organizations move from a distant form of governance to having their own governance as they moved toward independence. So perhaps we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about that. So Randal, I'd like to lead off with a question about integration. You've done a lot of work with governance and organizational performance. And so I would like it if you could describe what is the same here and what is different.
I think we need to distinguish here the for-profit and nonprofit world, because what I'm about to say is the same really for both, because they're based on larger principles. The locus of control obviously is different. In a for-profit that is not board-driven versus a nonprofit that would be board-driven. But in either case, there is an entity that is responsible for understanding with great clarity and communicating purposes for which the organization exists. And I think most for-profit leadership would agree with Drucker, what he said about nonprofits, in that all nonprofits exist to benefit, to create benefit for human beings. And I think most of the companies we respect, they exist to make money for their shareholders, but by doing something that makes some contribution to the greater good of society. So the relationship between the two is that there's a source that provides clarity, that defines what the benefits are and who is to receive them. If that doesn't exist, then you have no real keel on the ship, and the winds tend to batter, and you have a rudder, and the captain controls quite well. But the real mission fulfillment requires that clarity. And then the second thing that goes along with that is clarity provides the call to action, the invitation to aggressively pursue success, and defines what that is. But the board, or in the for-profit case, the controlling entity, also must provide boundaries that define what is not acceptable and monitor those boundaries so that what is produced is produced in a legal, ethical, moral, and culturally contextually appropriate manner. That's really the core of governance. Just as in the for-profit, there's governance going on, we don't call it that. It's the same things must go on in either place, and nonprofits rely on it because they're board-driven.
Hmm. So let's just kind of move this along a little bit then. So you've spent, as I mentioned, significant time working in a global organization, and you were helping each unit become more autonomous in different countries. So what did that experience teach you about this world of acquisitions and mergers and startups and spinoffs?
Wow. Well, in the school of global experience, you quickly come to appreciate how diverse we are in terms of our cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And you also come to appreciate how deep culture runs well below the conscious level in a group of people, in a culture. And so when we're dealing internationally and global business, it really is not practical or even possible to successfully, in the time frame of business, probe and understand another culture. So the key to success, as I experienced it and have observed, some of the more successful international operations, what they do is they establish at a high level the common ground between all the cultures is, and that generally pretty much coincides with purposes and the benefits for which the company exists. And so that, again, to use the maritime analogy, that provides a keel, regardless of whether the ship is from the United States or from some other culture. Those shared values create the common ground, create a common passion, purpose, and that generates the willingness, desire to produce. Now, some companies make, and nonprofit leadership makes the mistake of assuming, and it's not an intentional thing, it's not an evil thing most times, but it really does not have good effect. When there's the assumption, and I might also say we Americans we have a problem with this, assuming that our culture and our way is superior, and that everyone else should want it, and if not, at least they would benefit by having it. And so we, without meaning to, impose our culture. You can even see this in the global century-long missionary movement, of the 1800s. It was seen as hand in hand with colonial expansion because it was the imposition of a culture. Success in cross-cultural ministry, business, shared values locked in describes a direction of march. At that point, stepping back and identifying what's universally unacceptable is the next important step. And then the third, and the challenge, is letting the other, within reason, take its own shape. So I was surprised, but not, but it made a great deal of sense the first time I went to McDonald's in Germany and ordered a beer.
Mm-hmm.
Something we do in the United States, or spaghetti in Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm.
This is this principle in action.
Well,
And
thank you.
it's interesting. One of my mentors in sociology was talking about cross-cultural business, and he said, now, one thing, when you get something truly contextualized, where you're not imposing your own culture upon it, but you've established these values and you're arriving at something that truly shares the same values, but expresses within the own context. He said, one thing I can almost guarantee you, at least at first, and that is you're not going to like it. I think that's one of the real challenges and the humility that's required in leadership is to be able to see that those things which are essential are in place, and then encourage the other, even though personally may not like it.
I like the fact that you're bringing up context, Randall. That's a very difficult thing for senior leaders to get their minds wrapped around, and then their decisions, and then their actions. I'd like to also think about measures of success, which I would think are also a little bit contextual. In other words, they wouldn't just be tied to straight up profit in every case. And for many, there wouldn't just be a single driver for saying, hey, we're successful here. So what are the benefits of setting and maintaining measures that folks have agreed to for running business?
Well, I think that the history of business, including the current time, really eloquently makes the point here. And that is, in order to stay the course, you have to have something that doesn't change. And whereas society changes, the needs change, therefore the products may change. They may, a lot of things may change. But if you take a look, for instance, one of my favorite companies in this regard, I guess because I like pens, I like fountain pens. And at a really key moment, my parents got me a Mont Blanc 75th anniversary commemorative pen. It's interesting because in the cap, uh, engraved in the gold of the bottom of the cap that screws on, there's a little diamond, and under that is engraved 75 years of passion and excellence. And you know that I think that's a real eloquent statement because your passion comes and goes a lot in companies, and you have companies that have run a brilliant course and they just lost their passion, and the product began to deteriorate. The workforce began to experience problems and engagement, and you know, stock prices began to fall, and somebody else came along and replaced them eventually. Those companies like Mont Blanc, like Ritz Carlton, you say, what makes them, what makes them different? I mean, you can even put Apple and at least up until recently anyway, Starbucks. You
Mm-hmm.
know, there was a, in fact, I remember a few years ago when we first came up to the Seattle area, that was right when the founding or the former CEO who had retired came back and took over Starbucks again because he said, we have wandered from our core purposes. It had all these different menus and sandwiches and things going on. He cleared them all out and he said, we are about forming community around coffee. Let's get back to it. And he turned Starbucks around and sent it on another,
Mm-hmm.
extended growth curve. So something that is unchangeable, that forms the heart and core, the psyche of the company, has to be preserved. And that's what, uh, the measurements are just really looking at the results of that passion and seeing if they reflect quality and those core purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And without that, you know,
Randall,
you're
I'm smiling because you're getting at what I think is going to be a little bit deeper part of our conversation here about governance. That when you know what your context is and you're sensitive to it, when you know what your mission is and you're letting that be a chief and central measure of success, you're now talking about how you govern the thing, not just how it performs, how you recognize that you're, on the rails that you want to be on. You have also in your work been pretty strong with articulating the idea that the God of heaven is our best example of governance and how something can be governed. So, can you make that tangible and practical for us?
absolutely. And to do that, I'm going to have to speak into the unknown, at least as far as detail.
Okay.
Uh, we are told in general terms that there was a point in time where evil did not exist, that humanity was fully good. I called it very good. There was a way of functioning. There was an organized universe and an organized, environment that time as well. At some point along the continuum, there was an event that I don't like the general terminology of the fall, whatever it's called. There was a point after which people thought differently, and their relationship with God, at least temporarily, the promises were there regarding redemption. But at the time, anyway, relationship of God and the relationship of people themselves changed. And to just identify at a very broad level what happened is that as humanity looked to self to determine right and wrong, they began to look at power, which previously was something that was seen, as everything else was labeled, as very good. Granted, power, especially to a mortal flesh, can be dangerous and needs to be protected and insulated from harm. It's a good thing. From that time, power began to be a commodity instead. The commodity, because it was a commodity, is something that self could latch onto, acquire, barter, gain, lose, and all of our thinking has revolved around that. And course, organized power has taken various shapes through the various civilizations. And as our structure was formed through the guilds of the of the Europe and the colonial era, etc., age of expansion, this formed our basis for boards of directors and thinking. It's very much mercantile. It is very much power centric, and it is very much power as a commodity. And so it's interesting. I work with groups, some of whom are God acknowledging, God fearing groups of people. And when I work with them, we go right back to this point, and then we take what God defines power as, and we walk right through to the point we say, now let's roll this out. How does this actually play out in the boardroom? Um, I work with companies that are in boards that I would say are 100 or nearly so percent atheistic, with equal success. Simply don't go into what the source of the wisdom is. But we go back to the starting point that there is this wisdom, and it needs to come into the boardroom. And by and large, those organizations say how brilliant, how wise,
wow,
how this works.
yeah,
And it is nothing more than going back, saying we will not shape ourselves with the thinking of the fall. We will shape ourselves as God intended. We will look at power as a good thing. We will embrace it. When I'm working with churches, especially in the initial kind of workshopping this idea out, I will ask them at some point, how much of God's power do you want going through your church? There's always this dumbfounded silence for a moment or two, and people looking around like, what's the answer to this? And eventually somebody says, well, all we can get. Right. You want all you can get, then why do we work so hard to destroy and dismantle it, insulate it?
Yeah.
And so, but that really that's the core answer. It all goes back to that, and then it goes from that into very practical applications, at all levels of the company.
I'm just making a strong mental note here of these concepts that you've been articulating. So we've talked about context and how important that is. We talked about mission centeredness as a key evaluator and measure of an organization's success. And now we're talking about the stewardship of power, which is instrumental in being able to, if you're stewarding your power, to be sensitive to a context and then to say, hey, we're going to honor our mission. So if this is intriguing to an executive leader, they own a company, they're responsible for the P&L, they're recognizing that they have to take care of the governance structure, the investors, the owners, the people who have staked their investment with the organization, every bit as much as the marketplace itself, the customer, the client, the people that they employ. So if they want to take a more substantial step or even a first step in addressing their organization's governance, maybe they say, I've got to stop putting this off. I must attend to it. Where do you recommend they start?
That's a great question. And where it would be ideal to start and where they may be able to start could be two very different places. I almost hesitate a little bit.
Yeah.
So let me address the reality first. That is, a leader has to first recognize a need. And to the degree that we look around us, where everything is, like I said, it's driven from the ideas, the tree of knowledge, and not at the tree of life. We're part of an environment. We look around as Christians, we tend to Christianize that current, that existing status. We'll take all the obviously bad things, get rid of them, put in different nomenclature, whatever. We'll call them elder boards or whatever we do. And then we feel like we just need to live with that. The amount of complacency or satisfaction with that is almost universal. And so, if somebody, assuming your question, they see past that and they say, this is not working, I know there's something else or something different. I think that as a Christian, you would go to God, turn to look at and just say, God, how do you look at things? start being aware that there is a different way of looking. And what they're going to see at that point is they want all the power they can have going through that company. And they don't want to chop it up. They don't want to, you know, they don't want to diminish it. Now, most companies do want that, but they're afraid of the power. They chop it into pieces that can only function partially. Instead of saying, let's take all this power and then let's decide how it needs to be insulated, where damage would be done, and what kind of accountability to put into place to see that that does not happen. And then let the power flow. The way that that practically works out, I like to call the football field, or for my Canadian friends, the hockey rink. And it brings in a couple of key principles. One is, you look at how God tends to use power with us. He tends to prescribe outcome, which in the analogy of a football field would be akin to setting up the goals, the end zone, and so when that happens, the team they know what success is. They are invited to pursue it aggressively. Just cross that line as many times as you can, hopefully more than the other team. Now, God prescribes that, but if you look at how God tends to work with us, he proscribes boundaries. He doesn't prescribe boundaries. There'd be an endless list. 10 commandments are proscriptive. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do this. It's always a much smaller list, and it tends to be the important things. And as leaders, we should stop talking when the important things have been in place. Now, that's like putting boundaries on the football field. And what happens then? Instead of typically when there's a broken play in a company or an organization, everything stops while they figure out who was to blame. And then committees are put together to figure out what we need to do differently. And then eventually we get back into action. Whereas the way that it could work is that, like in football, there's a broken play. If the people are in bounds and they are pursuing the goal, any means they may choose to use is acceptable. And that's what, if a leader creates that for his people in his company, his church, or nonprofit organization, the level of engagement at the shop floor level is amazing. Level of engagement at the management level is amazing. The issues that tend to create disengagement that are caused by management being kind of frustrated, caught in the middle kind of things, and acting out goes away, and you get this. You get what looks like a great football team work on the field, and broken plays become touchdowns. So there's a nimbleness, etc., that in a nonprofit actually boosts it to a level of efficiency, operational efficiency that compares with a good for-profit company. And to achieve those things, I think, at least in my experience, those are the things that any leader I've worked with, or any CEO or executive director, starts to really light them up, you know, and they're ready to get their hands on that and take off with it.
Yeah, it's good to have a short-term action that you can somehow create in some alignment with that long-term need that you're trying to address, so that you don't lose sight of it.
Well, tell me if this is not, if you're looking for something beyond this, but you know, a good assessment gives a common vocabulary. Well, so you know, sometimes we'll do an assessment. Other times, as I'm a assess consultant by nature and trade, I don't always use an assessment, but we'll sit down and just talk together thoroughly and discover together what the situation is, and then begin to process how some of these things might change that.
Well, let's
understanding is key.
Yeah. So Randal, as we wrap this up, then let's make sure that a link to that assessment is included in the resource guide that we create, so that if somebody says, well, I'd like to get a common language, I'd like to figure this out, they'd have some access. And we'll also, of course, put how folks can contact you if they want to have more of a conversation with you. Sure. So let me say thank you for sitting in on this conversation with me, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mark.